Good afternoon and welcome to the Kratos and Stantec production of What Has the Environment Ever Done for Us for January.
That's a really Freudian slip,
isn't it? Status, that's a perfect one. I'm going to brand that. Today I will be hosting you, unfortunately, as Nick Kilby isn't available. So I'm going to quickly introduce you to our team. Our theme today is food, sustainable food in particular, and our guest is Patrick Holden from the Sustainable Food Trust, formerly of the Soil Association, and I'm sure he's going to tell us all about the other fantastic things he's done in his career to help us eat more sustainably. And as usual, we have Keith and Jenny from Stantec, who will be joining us to talk about the other issues, the headlines that we've had since Christmas, and some of the local stories that we've been picking up from clients and colleagues around the country. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Keith, who is going to lead on our interview. And if anyone who is watching us live would like to pose any questions, please pop it in the Q&A, and we will be happy to post that to Patrick at the convenient point. So over to you, Keith.
Thank you very much indeed, Vicky. Patrick, really, really nice to have you on the show, as it were. Over the last year, we've been doing this for about 12 months, and I think very early on, I said I'd really like to talk about food, and it's taken us sort of months to get around to doing this. In the intervening time, we've had a show when we've been up in Glasgow at COP. We've talked about energy, we've talked about transport, we've talked about planning and housing, and all of these sort of really important things that we need to talk about in the context of the climate challenge. And in my enthusiasm to talk about food, a lot of people have sort of said, well, why are you so keen to talk about food? What is it that is, so attractive about food and agriculture in the context of the climate challenge? And so I thought that's where we really ought to start, actually, because I arrived at your name via a friend of mine who's a farm manager of a local farm around here. He says, the person you need to talk to is Patrick about this. He's the founder. He started the Sustainable Food Trust. He knows all about this area. And he's the person who talks about it in the context, not just of what can agriculture do in its own right, but what can agriculture do as part of a wider strategy around planning and housing and transport. How does it all knit together into this overall campaign that we need to have about climate? So I wanted to start right at the beginning, if I could, with you, and just ask you, Patrick, just to say a little bit about you, why you started the Sustainable Food Trust. What were the things that you saw then that you were worried about? And how has that changed a bit over the last few years as this agenda has developed?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And also, just before I say a little bit more about the Sustainable Food Trust, I think your framing is very interesting because, of course, everything is connected, and all those other themes you've been exploring are entirely and centrally relevant to everyone's lives. But, of course, so is food. And we felt that, I think most people felt that food and agriculture were kind of missing in action at COP26. There wasn't enough, discussion about it. And the reason why it's so centrally important is because in the sort of rankings of things we can do to address climate change, agriculture is right up there, not least because most of the planet is now farmed, or most of the habitable area of the planet is now farmed. It used to be, pristine rainforest and wilderness and all that kind of thing. But if you look at the planet Earth from space now, and you look at the areas where people live, apart from the cities themselves, it's all farms, or it's not all farms, but it's mostly farms. So therefore, what we do on the farms of the planet is central to addressing the climate crisis, the nature crisis, the public health crisis, and the food security challenge. And I've been mindful of those issues for many years, but I guess they've come into focus much more, as they have for us all, quite recently. I mean, I was a little bit about me. I was a back to the lander. I grew up in London. I set up this community farm in 1973 with 6 others, where I'm speaking from now. And we were really naive and, we were kind of hippies really in those days. And we just wanted to do the right thing and live happily ever after on a community farm, being self-sufficient, all that kind of thing. And there've been lots of chapters to the work, the farming story here, but cut straight to the chase. In the early days, we tried to farm in an organic way right from the start, because we thought that was right. And there weren't really any standards, so we developed some standards for organic agriculture, and I was one of the people who did that, because really it was a means of trying to stay financially viable, because if we were farming in a conventional way and selling our products into the conventional markets, they were all subsidized, and you got money per ton and per litre of milk, and it was all, geared to intensive agriculture. We didn't want to do that from day one, so we thought, right, we'll try to sell our food to people who are interested in buying sustainably produced food, and that was the story of the development of the organic market. I got very involved with the Soil Association. I worked for that organisation for over 20 years, but then gradually I thought, actually, as climate change loomed and all those other issues that we're going to be discussing loom, I felt that the Soil Association, not that I'm not a fan of it, I am a great fan of it, but let's say it's the organic project, let's put it that way, was kind of self-limiting, because it was a group of people who wanted to buy food from a different system, probably paid more for it. And in the minds of the public, it wasn't all farming, it was a niche. And I became aware that unless all farming changed, and we all farmed in harmony with nature and addressed climate change and all the other things, we wouldn't have a livable planet. So the decision to leave the Soil Association was linked to my wish to work on a kind of wider stage. And during my time there, I built up a network of contacts all over the world. And some people said, well, why don't you set up an organization to try to accelerate the transition towards more sustainable food systems, working not just in the UK, but internationally. So that's what I did, with others, of course. And the organization is now 10 years old. We have about 20 plus staff. And I think we're making a difference, a small difference, but then we never were going to be a big delivery organization. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to be a catalyst. And that's what we're focusing on today.
And one of the things that occurs to me, your history and how you came to this is through your concern for the soil. And my mate Julian, in fact, I was listening to, he was doing a webinar a few days ago, and he has a real thing about the health of the soil and the importance of the health of the soil and looking after the health of the soil and using it to improve our ability to feed people, but also to sequester carbon rather than continue to release it by damaging the soil. So is that still at the heart of the concern of the Sustainable Food Trust? And how does that then relate to some of the other issues that we then are going to be coming to talk about, for example, around the importance of changing our diets, for example? I mean, I'm just sort of trying to move this and try and connect it step by step for people why, even when you start with something like the importance of soil, it still has a real land use relevance.
Yes, to your question about the soil and carbon, the soil is the world's second largest carbon bank after the oceans. And it's arguably, if we want to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, apart from some unbelievable techie stuff, which is probably impossible, the practical way in which we can do it at scale is to change the way we farm. Because during the industrial farming period, which let's say has sort of gathered momentum ever since the Second World War, it's really been extractive. It's been a mining operation. We've dined out and fed ourselves off the accumulated fertility of the soil. And in so doing, we have dramatically depleted the soil carbon bank. And that's because we've used fertilizers and pesticides and grown crop after crop on the same piece of land every year. And in so doing, we've burnt up a lot of the organic matter, which also held the carbon. And now what we've got to do, I think, not just in this country, but all over the world, is go back to farming systems which rebuild that soil fertility by locking up CO2 in the soil. And it's been estimated that if all the farmers of the world who are growing crops and producing food today did that, we might be able to draw down up to 100 parts of CO2 from the atmosphere and put it back in the soil. But of course, to the second bit of your question, doing that, in order to do that at scale, we're going to have to support the farmers to undergo that transition, and we're going to have to eat, ideally, what they produce after they've undergone that journey. And a lot of people today are thinking, but for good reasons, because everybody's saying this is what you should do, are switching to plant-based diets, because they think that animals, farm animals in general, and ruminants, that means cattle and sheep in particular, are causing high levels of emissions of methane, of other greenhouse gases, and they're not a very efficient way to use land. And in part that is true, because the intensive livestock systems, which most people eat the products from today, like intensive chicken, intensive pork, and these mega dairies, they are mainly fed on grain. And the grain that is being produced during the industrial period of agriculture is actually really bad for the soil, really bad for climate change. It's just bad. And the only reason why we've been able to have intensive livestock is because of agricultural intensification of plants, ironically enough. So if we go back to a farming system which doesn't exploit and deplete soil and cause wildlife, damage and pollute and everything, then we're going to have to go back to what used to be called mixed farming. And the reason for that is because the only way you can get the carbon back into the soil is to farm with a rotation, which has like a fertility building phase, where normally it would be legumes, grass and clover. In our case, that's what we grow here. So you have 4 or 5 years of grass and clover. And during that time, the carbon stocks in the soil really grow. And then you can grow crops. You could grow, as we do, oats and peas. And we also used to grow vegetables, and that's like there's the regenerative period of the farming, and there's the depleting period when you grow the crops that we can eat. But you can't do that year after year after year without nitrogen fertilizer. So the change that's needed, especially in the arable east of the United Kingdom, where they're just growing wall-to-wall crops every year, is to go back to mixed farming. And the problem with that, which could be an opportunity, but at the moment it's a problem, is that the only way you can turn that grass, which is the fertility building period of the crop rotation, into food that we can eat is to graze it with sheep or cattle or dairy cows, because then we can eat their meat or their milk or their dairy products, whatever. But everybody's going vegan, or they're trying to go plant-based, not understanding that we need to differentiate between those animals which are part of the problem, which they emphatically are, and those animals which are actually necessary and part of the solution, which is the grass-fed and the mainly grass-fed cattle and sheep. Now, if you're a critic listening to this, you'll say, well, hang on a minute, David Attenborough and just about everyone else is saying that cows emit methane, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas, and that causes climate change. And we would say our answer to that would be, because it's out there, that's what, I listen to Heart Radio when I'm putting out silage to our cows in the morning. And all the ads on Heart Radio at the moment are for veganuary. That's all for, whether it's McDonald's, McPlant or Aldi or Sainsbury's, they're all saying we do an exceedingly delicious vegan product. But I think that that's confusing people even more, because it's not that we want to go completely vegan. We don't. I mean, I'm nothing ethically against veganism or vegetarianism. But if you don't have an ethical injection and you want to be part of the solution, actually what we need to eat is what the regenerative farmers will produce when they switch. And that diet actually will have quite a lot of livestock products in it. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but there's a lot to get across there.
I'm so relieved to hear you say that, because the idea of going vegan is it's the one thing I don't think I could do. But I don't know about you, didn't this take you back to being 9 at school, and that whole sort of cycle of the farm? I was like, oh, I remember learning about that. That's
that
exactly
is it.
What we learned.
That's what
7-year
all the children,
rotation.
It's basically was right. And, all the fertility of the soils of this country and the world was built through an interaction very often on the grasslands anyway, between ruminants and grass. And that built the soil fertility that we've been dining out on, and now we've got to put it back again. And it doesn't mean to say we have to just eat nothing but ruminant livestock products, obviously, and we can grow more vegetables, and we should, but they shouldn't be grown in the great big intensive vegetable producing areas of the fens, which by the way are stripping the carbon out of those soils at a rapid rate, which never see an animal. The vegetables need to be grown as part of this rotation, which I've just described, because then they will be much more nutrient dense and much more delicious, and also better for the environment. So it's not the cow but the how, as has been said, but it's also not the plant but the how. It's not just about eating plants. How were they grown? I mean, we don't want to eat soya and genetically modified soy or palm oil or avocados grown intensively on the other side of the planet. That is not part of the solution. So I think there's a huge amount of information which has been not really shared with people very much for the last few years. And it's, if you ask a young person who is kind of just a normal person who's trying to do the right thing at the moment, what they think they should be doing, they'll probably say, well, I should go plant-based or vegan. Actually, I quite like meat and I have the occasional bacon sarnie or something. But actually, if you say, what's the least worst meat to eat, they'll probably say chicken. And actually, that is, if it's intensively produced, that's the worst meat you could eat, whereas the best meat is the one that everybody's giving up. So we need a big discussion about this, and it's in the detail, and it's really interesting.
I don't know whether or not you're a fan, but I've recently read the James Reedbanks books.
I think he's fantastic.
And if anyone who listens to this ever wants to sort of get into it a bit and hear from somebody who's been through that transitional process, James Reedbanks, absolutely top notch. Anyway,
he is.
It is.
He's angry, but he's wonderfully articulate. He writes beautifully, and of course he comes from generations of farmers in the Lake District, and he's across all these issues. And he was one of the guest editors on the Today programme over Christmas, and he did a brilliant job.
Yeah. So one of the things that we touched on very briefly, just as we went through that, was one of the reasons why we've ended up with this sort of intensive agricultural regime is price and the supermarket environment that we all now live in. And so in order to encourage a change in practice here in the UK, at least, then price is going to be a really important component of figuring out, making sure that everybody is able to afford to eat the products of a regenerative farming society. So how do we tackle that problem? How do we find a way of being able to create a more climate-friendly agricultural regime, but also one which is based around social justice?
Well, there's a lot in that. I mean, how much should food cost? That's a good question, isn't it? I think it should cost the true price that it costs to produce it without damaging the environment or damaging public health or causing climate change. And the so-called cheap food that we've got used to eating over the last decades actually is dishonestly priced, because it's as if if you're running a business, a farming business, for instance, if you think of it as being like you've got the balance sheet, and if you're running an accounting system, you have the balance sheet and then you have the trading account. And what most farms have been doing is they've been depleting the balance sheet of the soil and all the assets that they have in order to grow and sell cheap food. And they haven't been financially accountable for the damage done, either to climate change or for nitrogen fertilizer getting into the water, or for the damage to public health. So the apparently so-called cheap food that we got used to buying is actually not really cheap at all. It's hugely expensive. It's just we're not paying the cost on the price ticket on the food. So I think we're going to have to get used to the fact that good food, real food, nutrient-dense food, which comes from farming systems which don't damage the environment and coexist with biodiversity and everything else, that is going to cost more. But if you think about gas, which is very interesting, isn't it? So who would have thought, as you said 3 or 4 years ago, the price of gas is going to, whatever it is now, treble or something, and we're going to have to pay for it. You would have said, well, that's not going to happen. Government would never stand that. But actually, it has happened. And interestingly enough, the price of nitrogen fertilizer, which is the kind of main drug of choice for growing intensive food, has tripled just in the last few weeks. So I think that we shouldn't shy away from the fact that we're going to have to pay a greater percentage of our disposable income on food. Now, that brings up the question of how do we feed people who fall into quite a significant bracket, maybe it's 20% of all the people in this country, for whom affordability of food is a big issue. I think that's up to the government. I think we have to give them green food stamps. We have to create a safety blanket net to protect people for whom food affordability is a big barrier. And actually, we can do that. We can also eat differently. I mean, so few people nowadays have cooking skills. And it is possible to eat really good food as long as you cook and you don't buy heavily processed foods. So there's going to need to be, I think, an education program as well to make sure that people of lower income groups who will have to pay a significant amount for their food of their disposable income. By the way, it used to be 30% of the average family income went on food in the 70s, and I think it's under 10% today. So there's a big adjustment coming there, but government will have to step in and help.
Yeah, but one of the other possible avenues is also changing our local economies. It seems to me, in terms of my reading, that a lot of the other source of lost accountability in this cycle is the amount we move food around the planet for no discernible gain. In fact, actually, the people who lose out from that is, well, not only the climate from the moving it all around bit, but also local people, because they're not engaged in growing the food, selling the food, cooking the food, being part of the local economy. And that seems to me to be a real opportunity for this country to kind of reinvent what that looked like in a more modern way.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's difficult because we're trying to do that here. We're trying to sell, we're trying to add value to so we make cheese on this farm. And we also are rearing our male dairy calves, which are Ayrshires, which is a native dairy breed, and producing so-called ruby veal. So, we're rearing them onto an age, and we're trying to sort of process it locally, get them slaughtered locally and process it locally. But it's not easy to do that, either because the environmental health people come down on you like a ton of bricks if you do anything wrong. And then if you slaughter at the local slaughterhouse, the slaughterhouse charges are higher, which they should be. And so it's quite hard to compete. So, and also half the time the infrastructure isn't there. So even if people want local food, all that sort of lattice work of processing and distribution systems has gone. And so we're having to sort of reinvent it, and there are all the bot schemes and the farmers markets springing up everywhere now, which is great. But if you look at, and just take round here in West Wales, you look at where most people buy their food, it's either at Sainsbury's or the Co-op in Lambton. And they've become very used to buying food where they have no idea about the story behind it, no idea whatsoever, because the label doesn't tell you. And to get them to think about supporting local growers and farmers is a huge cultural change. And the supermarkets who want to buy cheap and make as much margin as they can, they wouldn't be able to afford many of the local products, or they wouldn't suit them in some way or another. And so there's all that change going to happen as well. I'm just give you one example. We grew carrots here for 26 years. And when we first started growing them, the manager of the Co-op in Lambton said to me I went to him, and I said, would you be interested in buying our carrots? And we were selling them in bunches at the time. And he said, yeah, sure. Just, bring me 20 bunches and meet me around the back of the Co-op, and we'll put them on the shelves. And then after no time at all, we were selling 200 bunches a day, and it was fantastic. But then when the supermarkets all did their central packing and everything, we had to eventually, believe it or not, we were sending carrots that were packed in Lampeter, because there was a pack house there, then that closed, to Manchester, to the Co-op Central Distribution Warehouse, for them only to come back to Lampeter again. And that's the craziness of the food systems we've got into. And we had to stop growing carrots eventually after 26 years in 2006, because the last pack house that we were sending our carrots to was in Peterborough, because all the ones in the west of Britain had closed down. So we were having to send them 230 miles. And of course, it didn't work economically and on other levels as well. So we gave up. But I think we're now going to have to put all that stuff back again. And even the supermarkets are beginning to realize that now, but they don't know how to do it. I mean, to be honest, I think none of us quite know how to do it. We know some of the models that might work, but how to take them to scale, I mean, that's a massive question.
So this is where I take a big leap, Vicky. Okay. So most of the development that takes place in this country, if it's not urban regeneration, is taking place on currently or previously agricultural land of one sort or another. The farm owners are doing deals with housing landowners, the housing developers, to create a deal which sees land to be developed with infrastructure and housing and other forms of development for a price which gives a return to the housing developer and to the landowner. And as part of the deal that is done, there is usually an assumption around what the infrastructure package and the Section 106 requirements are for that land, and in very simple terms. And when we talk about Section 106 contributions, we talk about all sorts of things around affordable housing, about transport contributions, about energy contributions or schooling, or it could be a whole variety of things, but we never talk about food. Now, given the crisis that we have in terms of the need for us to change the way in which we do agriculture, and the fact that there are farmers doing deals with housing owners, creating a Section 106 pot and a development platform, isn't there an opportunity to start transforming the economy of farming and housing, or farming and developments in new communities? And because new communities need employment, new communities need food, new communities need green open space, new communities need places where you can deal with flood relief. There are so many different ways in which the wider rural area and the new community could be integrated in a way that could start right at the beginning, at the way in which the deal is put together. It just seems to me that we're missing a trick here somewhere. And I've never really known whether or not I'm talking completely out of my backside when I talk about that sort of thing, or whether or not there are real possibilities there.
I think there are enormous possibilities. And funnily enough, I know a chap down in Hampshire who was approached by by the local town who wanted to do an urban expansion on his land. And he said, I'm not going to do it unless I'm allowed to design the whole housing development in such a way that it can cater, it can link to the land around the other land that I've got left on my farm, and so that the farm can produce food for that community. And that was his condition. And he's into the development now, and it looks really exciting, because it seems to me that all new urban development should be designed around local food systems, and that would include some of the things we've been, I mentioned already: abattoirs, pack houses, places where people can go maybe buy food at farmers markets. And I think that idea could be in part funded by Section 106 agreements. Why not? And actually, it's bad enough that we're still losing agricultural land, because actually as they say, they ain't making it anymore. So if we build them too much more, we won't have enough land to feed ourselves. But if we are going to build them, let's at least have the kind of deal that you describe. I think it's really important, and I think that more of that sort of thing will happen in the future.
And so if one of our other colleagues who wasn't able to join us today, Johnny Riggle, Johnny has actually written a paper about feeding the world. He comes at it from a slightly different perspective. But one of the things he talks about in his paper is the intensification of agriculture, not in the sort of fens sense, as we were talking about, but in the sense of redeveloping old warehousing units and using them to grow to do farming in an intensive building, or
the concept of vertical farms, that's it, isn't it?
Vertical farms.
I know, hydroponics, growing with electric lights and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. But also not just that, but also, looking at different ways of creating artificial meats or artificial foods. This is where he was going. Is there a way of us reducing the amount of agricultural land that we need so that we can be using the land less intensively, more space for rewilding, more space for nature? Is there a different balance that we could reach where, an innovative community development might be able to take on some of those new and interesting ways of creating food? I mean, and again, that I don't know if you see any of that happening, or whether or not you even think it might be a good thing for society to be investing in.
Well, there is a big discussion going on about exactly this at the moment. There are two camps about how we should feed the world. One of them is you could call it the land sparrow. So that means intensify further on the best land and use all the techniques that you just described. That will release more land for nature, for rewilding, or for, just letting it do its thing. And the other camp, of which I'm a member, is the land sharers, who say, no, let's not do that. And I'll come to why I think we shouldn't do that in a sec. If we farm in harmony with nature, and we give up using all the chemicals, which everyone's become so used to in farming, nature can coexist with food production. And that way we won't need to, section off great chunks of land to rewild. Not that you can be against rewilding. I mean, it's obviously wonderful, but I don't think there's enough land. If we're going to feed the whole human population, I think we will need a lot of the land for farming. But in my experience farming here, you can have an abundance of nature, of butterflies, of birds, of small mammals, of plants that grow in and amongst the grass or the grain crops we grow, as long as you don't use chemicals. And I think the reason why your friend's, sustainable intensification, or whatever he calls it, is not right is because I don't think we can. I think there's such a thing as biological intensification. I mean, I've got a great friend down the road here who's got polytunnels on an acre and a half of land and feeds them with compost and grows the most delicious vegetables. And I think that sort of intensification is great. But personally, if it's lab meat or hydroponic plant production, which actually, interestingly enough, all the salads you now buy in supermarkets are produced hydroponically with nutrient solution fed into sort of like glorified cotton wool, rock wool it's called. So all the tomatoes, lettuces, cucumbers, everything that supermarkets sell now is no longer grown in soil. And I think there are going to be nutritional and health consequences to that. I don't think you can improve on the soil, nor do I think, this is a bit more controversial, you can improve on the digestive system of a ruminant animal, a cow in our case, with some sort of laboratory process. I'm not saying people don't have a right to try and produce lab meat, but why not produce it with cows? That's what we're doing. And the cows are part of our farm ecosystem. And you could say, well, animals are beings and they have feelings, which I think they do, and slaughtering is abhorrent and all that kind of thing. But I think this is what we're trying to do here. You can love your animals and care for them. And even when they lose their lives, it is a sacrifice. But I think one can do that mindfully. And if the animals are loved during their lives and fed and cared for properly, I think it is a sacrifice, but I think it's one that my conscience is comfortable with. And anyway, plants have feelings too, as we now know from, all these amazing books that are being published about, plant plants that communicate with their relatives and all that sort of stuff. So I think we have to accept that we as human beings are displacing we're taking our place as the replacement for the top predator in the ecosystems. And that brings with it a lot of responsibilities. But we are the top predator, and maybe there are too many of us and blah, blah, blah. But while we're here, I think that's the challenge.
That's fascinating. I've got a couple of questions, Patrick, before we have to move on to other topics. Jenny, Keith, I know you're chomping at something else, but I want to give Jenny a chance to ask anything that she wants to ask, and then I'm going to bring you in to round it up, if that's okay, Keith.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think I was hoping to sort of touch on that. You were talking about mixed farming, and you were talking about how we can regenerate nature sort of without going as far as this rewilding concept. So it's quite interesting to hear you kind of paint the picture of that, because I think quite often people hear about biodiversity and farming and they don't quite know how to picture that in their head or what's needed. So I was wondering if you talked about mixed crops and having grasses and that support butterflies and everything like that. But I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit so people get a better understanding of what that looks like in reality.
Okay, so we farm 300 acres here, and it's quite, it's a bit hilly, it's quite high rainfall, it's not marginal land, but it's definitely more challenging. So much so that 150 of the 300 acres we farm can't be ploughed for crops. It's just too steep or boggy, or, it's quite fragile. So on that 150 acres of land, we're growing, apart from the hedges and the odd bit of woodland and things like that, and a pond, we're growing grass. And the grass, we've never used any chemical fertilizer, for 49 years here. And as a result of that, the grass grows, but it's also lots of clover, of plantain, of yarrow, of all sorts of species, which are wild flowers of various descriptions, which grow in the grass. And then if we grow it for hay, there's all this biodiversity, and that's food for insects, for soil invertebrates, for all the above ground life, and of course for birds. So, that's the sort of base of the food pyramid, if I can put it that way. The other 150 acres, we can grow crops, but only 2 years in a row before it has to go back to fertility building, which is grass and clover, which we sow. And then we grow a couple of crops of oats and peas. And as I said, we used to grow vegetables. So that's the kind of farming rotation. So in any 1 year on 300 acres, we only have about 30 acres of oats and peas. And on this farm, we actually feed that to the dairy cows. We could, of course, turn it into muesli or something like that, but instead we turn it into cow muesli, and the cows love it. Interestingly enough, the cows prefer to eat the grain grown on our farm than brought in stuff, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to practice the circular economy. We're trying to produce as much food as is possible without depleting nature's balance sheet. And that includes wildlife, it includes people, it includes all the skills. It's a cultural thing. I think it's also a spiritual thing, that we're kind of looking after a little tiny bit of the planet, and we need to leave it in a better state than we found it. And that's why where I'm now, I'll just show you the barn. We've just done this, and this is we want this barn to be part of an education space where we want to invite people to the farm, and because we think farms should be places of learning, places of music, places for retreats, places where people come to them and are nourished by them, not just physically, but in other ways. And so I feel that the farms of the future need to be those educational platforms for people to come to. And that way we can celebrate what we're doing here. And also we want to measure it, by the way. So at the moment, we're selling our cheese as organic, but actually what we want to be able to tell people who eat our food is how good our farming system is for the soil, is for nature. What species of wildflowers and butterflies and farmland birds we've got, and how it's good for the people that work here as well. So we're working on a new labelling scheme, so that would be more easy to understand.
Can I ask, I've got a question that's come in, which is fantastic, so thank you, Harriet, for your question, but I want to combine it with something I was thinking about. One of the issues I have is relates to greenwashing. People are now able to go and buy their milk from one of these machines that, from the local farm, or my husband has bees, so people can buy honey from their own street or their allotment. My question is, are we making ourselves feel good about ourselves because we're ticking a few of those boxes? Cucumbers, I'm mortified that they're all hydroponic.
Well, they're not if they're organic, by the way. If you buy
no,
organic,
I know, but I'm slightly concerned. I have 2 tortoises, and they rely on lettuces and things in the winter. They're not old enough to hibernate, and I'm mortified that they're not being given proper ones. I'm going to have to spend more on my lettuces. Are we? Yeah. Are we sort of just not doing it properly? And that relates to the question I have from Harriet, which is relating to urban environments and the use of market sort of hinterlands in how do we make sure that your rural idyll sounds fantastic, but it is a couple of 100 miles away from a conurbation that needs to eat, and we can't sort of build a farm in a city. But is it enough that we have community gardens? Is it enough? Is it a good thing that we try to plant the blueberries on the side of the street to encourage people because they then take the next step? Or does it make people feel like, they've ticked that box and they can go back down and, buy their cheap food from the supermarket? What's your thinking on that?
I think it's a totally wonderful thing if you plant blueberries of incredible edible and all that stuff that's going on, or even if you have a tiny window box and you're growing a little bit of stuff, or you grow it in your garden. I think every single thing connects you with nature, probably improves the quality of your nutrition, etc. And I think what happens in cities, I am a Londoner, and my daughter Alice lives in Wanstead, and she is part of a project called Growing Communities, which is based in Stoke Newington. And she grows salad crops in soil, of course, organically, in Dagenham for this Growing Communities project. And she's also involved with a new farm called Sitopia, which is in Greenwich, which is apparently a 90-acre farm. I haven't visited it yet, but it's amazing. And it's being they're setting up a land trust and trying to raise money for it. So I think that for urban farms and urban growing and peri-urban farms, and making links between the farms around London, for instance, and the people who live in London, sort of, two-way contracts where it's like a community-supported agriculture idea where the people who are buying food at the farm say, look, we'll buy your food if you grow for us. So it's a two-way relationship of trust. And I think we need lots of new models like that. And let's say that London could not possibly grow all its salad crops and vegetables inside the London area, but it could grow quite a lot. And then for the farms outside London, who are at the moment just commodity slaves producing raw materials for processed foods, if they could rechange their system so that they could be suppliers to people who live in the cities, that would be a fantastic thing. So to your point about greenwash or self-delusion, no, I don't think so. I think this is you're describing what needs to happen. And we need a good labelling scheme which makes it transparent how good the food is. So like if you're buying milk from a milk vending machine, I think that's great too. Obviously, there's the question of how the cows were looked after. But if we have a good labelling scheme, you could have the vending machine and the label, and you know exactly what the cows were fed on and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, because I think it's a really tricky one, isn't it? Where, as you say, that self-delusion. But I mean, I have to say, cucumbers grown on your allotment do not taste anything like cucumbers in a supermarket. I mean, my husband hates cucumber, and we fed him cucumber from our allotment. It's a different
It fruit. Really is.
It's a different
And think about it. Cucumbers grown in proper soil, hopefully, fertilized with compost and, naturally, compared to a cucumber, which has just got its roots in a bit of rock wool, which is fed with nitrogen fertilizer and a few other trace elements. I mean, that's like feeding yourself on a stomach tube. It's not.
No.
The soil is the stomach of the plant.
Listen, Joe, I'm seeing science fiction now. We've got to wrap this up.
We do have to wrap it up, and I just want to wrap it up with this, if that's all right, Vicky. Okay. So many people who are or will be listening to this are familiar with the local plan process. And the local plan process looks at the local area and decides about where development can go, and how it's going to be promoted, and its sustainability strategy, its transport strategy, its energy strategy, all of the things that are to do with the growth and health of the local area. Why isn't there a food strategy as part of our local plans? I'm not sure that I've ever seen one. And could it address the ability, if it's out in a more rural area, the ability of the land in its area to be sequestering carbon as part of its net zero campaign? Can it be looking at how it might be able to be dealing with its open space requirements, its health requirements, its employment requirements, its craft and cultural requirements? It just seems to me that there's a lot that could be done if we thought about it more strategically, and that seemed to be one place where we might be able to do it. And I don't know if you've ever been party to a conversation where that might have been the subject.
I think you're completely right, and I think all local authorities should have food plans, and I think that the appetite for that is really growing now. I'm part of a conversation in Wales. I mean, there's a woman who used to be the Environment Minister in Wales called Jane Davidson, and she introduced this bill into the Welsh Parliament called the Health and Wellbeing of Future Generations Bill, and it basically put a requirement on politicians effectively to think about the generations of the future. And that has all sorts of consequences, including, of course, food. And so I think that local authority plans ought to have food and farming and food security and health all linked together. And so I think you're onto something really, really important.
Right. So, and yeah, because I missed energy out of that little thought.
Energy,
and yeah, absolutely. So I wasn't sure, Vicky, whether or not you, in your role as a local councillor, a council leader, have feel as though that's something you guys ought to be doing.
Well, bearing in mind we've just got our options and issues and options consultation out now, I may well throw that in, and it may be that some of our listeners are in the same situation in their local authority, so we'll move that forward.
Where are you?
I'm in Poole in Dorset.
Poole in Dorset, lovely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's it's been absolutely fascinating. There's so much we could have spent the whole time on this, but we do have to cover a couple of other issues, and feel free, Patrick, to give us your thoughts if you wish. Jenny, I'm going to call on you now to take us through some of our big headlines. The last time we met was just before Christmas. And I didn't think there was much going on, and then suddenly in the last couple of days we've sort of like gone bing 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 bing.
Yes, there's been a lot going on, so I certainly cannot do all of the headlines justice, but we'll focus on energy. Perfect timing, Patrick. He's gone over to put a log in his wood-burning stove. Energy and heating. And then we'll canter from looking across the sort of the UK picture on the energy crisis right now to a couple of local examples around Manchester and transport. So I think unless you've been hiding in a hole, it would not have missed your attention that gas prices are soaring and our energy bills are due to go up. And that's part of a whole bigger picture around the rising cost of living. I've seen some scary statistics from the Bank of England about potential inflation rising up to 6%. And this perhaps is a topic for discussion on another webinar, but we've talked about the politicization of climate change and perhaps how this could be causing big rifts in the political parties about reaching net zero and the costs to get there. Now, on the energy crisis, I was doing a little bit of research just to try and break down this issue and what's really causing it. So in summary, the global picture is that wholesale gas prices have increased dramatically in the last year. Patrick mentioned it. Last year, they actually rose 250%. In August alone, gas prices rose 70%. And globally, this is part of a rapid pace of economic bounce back after COVID, during COVID. And the strain from lots of different worldwide events, some of which are driven by climate change. So we had a bitter winter in the Northern Hemisphere last year. There was warmer, a sticky kind of period over in Asia, and that increased the costs and the demand for electricity and air conditioning. we've had a very windless summer, which I'll come back to in terms of wind. And interestingly, things like drought in Brazil, which reduced the hydropower production, have also had an impact on global gas prices. So there's just some influences. And here in the UK, I was reading an article which I'll post a link to because it's very interesting. It kind of goes into the whole background of why we're here. And it talks about, without pausing too much to talk about previous political decisions that were made and why they might have impacted where we are right now in terms of the cost of gas. It's looking forward, and it's talking about the UK energy mix and why it's going to be really important to address this head on, particularly in relation to the growth of offshore wind and how that's going to keep increasing the sort of as the mix in the mix of our UK energy needs. In Scotland, here's a news piece. Last week, ScotWind was announced that's announced 17 new projects around the coast of Scotland, and that could generate up to 25 gigawatts of capacity. And one of the issues that we're facing is that we need to be able to balance out the intermittency of offshore wind going forward. And according to Dieter Helm, who has written a very comprehensive sort of essay around this, they say that the solution is really going to have to be including gas in future, whilst also focusing on carbon capture and storage, which I think we talked about last year, and the fact that currently there's no large-scale viable project that's been delivered for carbon capture and storage. So that's absolutely necessary. One other way of supporting sort of balancing that whole equation is also looking at green hydrogen in the future. But again, the technology is not here right now, so that's not going to be possible in the near future to help balance out this very complex energy picture. So a couple of minutes on other news and headlines, which are partly also sort of linked to this increase in living costs. Interestingly, in Manchester, Andy, the mayor is currently about to go back to government to try and delay phase 2 of the Clean Air Act in Manchester. So phase 1 is going to come through, so the Clean Air Zone is going to be implemented across the city. So in Manchester, there's 152 areas across 10 authorities which have illegal or unsafe levels of nitrous oxide, which are essentially kind of caused by vehicles. It's one of the most congested cities, and this has huge health implications. So approximately 1,200 deaths a year are caused by poor air quality in the city. So the Clean Air Zone is going to be crucial to help alleviate that. But one of the issues with the current plans for the second phase of the Clean Air Zone was that the rules were going to make it almost impossible for certain small businesses to even operate. Now, interestingly, one of the examples I heard was actually a shepherdess on the outskirts of Manchester whose business was going to be made completely unviable by a charge of £70 a week from the Clean Air Zone because there wasn't currently a vehicle available to her. And interestingly, these sort of these cost issues are all wrapped up in global supply chain issues, and it makes having a compliant vehicle for lots of business operators in Manchester too expensive or difficult. And those businesses may face severe financial hardships. So I think this Manchester example is just a classic exemplification of the complexities of climate change and how you need to think really, really carefully about solutions, the timing of those. Are the technologies viable? Can people pay for them? And they did talk about these sort of the funding mechanisms that are available to support the Clean Air Zone are not enough because the global supply chains aren't yet there. So I just thought that was a really, really interesting example. And the final point, with a link to Manchester, was that the Olympic medalist and cyclist Chris Boardman, who previously was part of the B network, which was the largest joined up system of cycling and walking networks in the UK. So he had a real big role in that active travel system implementation in Manchester. He's now been appointed to Active Travel England, which is the government's new board to drive up standards of cycling and walking infrastructure across the whole of England. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens there with the start of that body. And one of their remits is going to be to inspect and publish reports on how highways authorities are performing on active travel. So it's going to play a scrutiny role in that respect.
I suspect he's going to be absolutely inundated by the cycling brigade, of which I am one, about about all sorts of things, sack cycling and active modes. It'll be very, very interesting to watch.
An irony there, isn't there, that you have a city where air pollution is a major problem, and as a cyclist, and I'm not a lycra clad cyclist. I'm a sit up and beg with my Mary Poppins basket cyclist. As a cyclist, who wants to cycle somewhere where you're breathing in awful fumes? So you've got that difficulty of sort of like, actually, the cycling will help the clean air, but actually you don't want to be cycling somewhere where you're breathing in, especially if, like me, you're huffing and puffing as you're cycling rather than electric bikes. But so I've got a couple of stories to share. One of them, it relates to something similar, actually, is the announcement of Leicester as the second city that's going to be going for a workplace parking levy. And the first one was Nottingham, first one in Europe. And that's been in place for nearly 10 years. And talking to the people in Nottingham today about the success of it, it's been absolutely, game-changing in terms of the amount of money that they've spent. They've raised, I think it was £83 million raised in 8 years from businesses. And it's generated £750 million in total spend, with the amount of inward investment is leveraged in transforming the congestion levels and the increase in the use of public transport. So these schemes, really can be transformational, and that's focused around public transport, not so much around active travel. All of the money has gone into their tram system and their bus system, but it'd be really interesting to watch and see whether Leicester managed to get those through. It does feel like it's the alternative to the clean air zone. Obviously, Portsmouth did one recently in a very small area where, there's been a lot of challenge around, is clean air zone the right way to go. But, it's fascinating, isn't it, that the legislation came in more than 20 years ago. 10 years ago, we had one. We're finally getting the second city. I just wonder whether the increase in active travel and the acceleration post-COP will actually see us start, moving much more quickly on this, rather than having to wait another 10 years for the third city to do it. Final story I must share with you, because I've been on the phone to the councillor that's led it, and it's so exciting. I'm going to try and do it locally. Here's a project that every parish council, community organisation, whatever, can take up. In South Somerset, they have bought 2 thermal imaging adapters, let's call them, for mobile phones. And they are using them to map the heat loss from homes. It's a very, very simple scheme. I think they spent £300 on this kit. Every parish council in South Somerset District, East Division, has got an environment champion. And residents are being encouraged to contact their environment champion to borrow the device to actually photograph their home. Has to be done in the winter, has to be done at night, to establish where the heat's coming out. And the main issue, a bit of a spoiler here, is their front doors. And the big answer is that doesn't need to be an expensive problem. A heavy curtain behind the door is actually having a huge impact on heat loss. I was talking to the councillor myself earlier on about a particular window I've had a £2,000 quote to replace. And he said, well, is it your window or is it the glass? Because maybe you don't need the whole thing replacing, maybe you need the glass upgrading. And it's fascinating that sometimes we're encouraging people to spend a lot of money on a big retrofitting project without actually doing the very basic thing, which is seeing where the heat's coming out and trying to fix it with low-cost, immediate steps. And they're doing it in South Somerset. So, for £300, it's something that every councillor in the land could probably get the funding to do, and actually set about street by street having an incremental impact on emission loss in homes. Simple.
It's great. Vicky, I thought you were going to say something about the COP26 president's speech today.
Well, I was, but there was nothing in it, was there? Just lots of hot air, as far as I could tell.
Well, just turning it back to the conversations that we've been having today, because actually today's been about practical schemes that we can get involved in, practical schemes that we can be working on with our farming colleagues, with our environmental health colleagues, or with our and start really beginning to take action in places that where we can do something. And Mr. Sharma clearly has got a bit of an issue about getting action out of everybody else at this very high strategic level. And somehow, those of us who are operating at more of the ground level need to show him how to do it.
I think you're right. I was a little unfair. It was almost all full of hot air. But the truth is, it is about the actions, isn't it? And Patrick's demonstrated, that actually you put your money where your mouth is. And if my cucumber grown in my allotment and my beehive in my garden, if they are genuinely making a difference and they're having an impact on the people next door who say, oh, I might do bees myself, it is that incremental thing. And it is about, I think I said it before Christmas, about the answer being everybody just takes one step forward wherever they already are. As long as we're always stepping forward, then we're doing the right thing. And to be fair to Alok Sharma, it must be incredibly frustrating when people around him are going backwards. And if everybody just took those little steps forwards, we'll get there. So, yeah, we should give him every encouragement to make sure that we don't. I think he said it will wither on the vine if action does not follow the words. I think that's the right language.
Yeah,
so,
and it'll wither on the vine if people aren't working at it from the bottom up, and we're all ready for those strategic changes when they come.
Yeah.
So, it
exactly.
does need both directions.
Sounds like a fabulous place to leave it. So I want to thank Patrick Holden, our guest from today. It's been fascinating. I'm sure we'll speak again.
And can we all come to your place? It looks fantastic.
We're going to come live from Wales.
The answer is yes. That's what it's created for. So we're only in the early stages, but we hope to have a place where people can come and stay as well. We're working on accommodation because, for reasons I said before, but it's been great to join you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming. It's been a delight.
Until next month, we're not quite sure what we're going to be talking about yet. It will be dependent on our guests, but it's been lovely to have you. This is a Kratos and Stantec production. What has the environment ever done for us? Our whole back catalogue is available on our YouTube channel. Just look us up, and you can also get a podcast to go for your bike ride, to go and buy your milk from the vending machine, and watch it as you listen to it as you go. So nice to see you all. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.